Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Mualani pre-release analysis. Mualani is one of the characters that has gotten the most beta changes that weren't really changes to her mechanics, but definitely changes to her balance, and we're going to be talking about all of that. But as usual, we're going to start with a quick little overview of what she does. Base HP, 15,185. This is on the higher side when it comes to character HP. Take a look at character HP. There's not too many characters that have more than she does. Right about one more HP than Nilo, taking her place as the 4th highest base HP. Obviously, though, she doesn't have HP Ascension, so she doesn't actually have as much HP as Nilo, but whatever, you get the point. However, her base defense of 570 it's definitely on the lower side. When you look at high HP characters that are, gonna spend time on field, it's definitely not the same level as Hu Tao. It's a lot less, a lot closer to Neuvillette, which isn't to say that she's squishy at all, because, if you've ever played Neuvillette, you'll know that it's kind of hard to die on him. But obviously, she doesn't have the same sort of self-healing that Neuvillette does, so her relatively low defense will still sometimes have an impact. It's not always going to be an issue, but it is something it's useful to know about it. It's useful to know that even though she's going to have high HP, she can still get hit pretty hard. Base attack, 182, and we're going to see this doesn't matter at all because none of the useful parts of her kit scale with attack. She is an HP scaler, and her Ascension stat is crit rate. And honestly, her Ascension stat being crit rate is bad. It's not bad to have good stats, and crit rate is a good stat, but crit rate is one of the very few stats, if not the only stat in the game, that actually has a hard cap. If you go higher than 100% crit rate becomes completely useless, right? Any crit rate above 100% is completely wasted and doesn't increase your damage whatsoever. Genshin is not a game that has a mechanic that converts excess crit rate to crit damage or anything like that. And as we're gonna see when we talk about the artifacts, but that is worth mentioning now, one of the new artifact sets coming in Natlan is going to be her best in slot artifact set, and it gives you 40% crit rate, which means that Mualani's base crit rate of 24.2 plus the 40% from that gets you to 64.2 to begin with. He's a catalyst and an HP scaling catalyst. So if we look at the sort of weapons that you'd have available on an HP scaling catalyst, well, obviously, we already have a character to compare her to in Neuvillette, and Neuvillette loves Sacrificial Jade. Sacrificial Jade gives you 36.8%, which, with the 64.2 base she would have with her base crit rate and her kit, brings her to 101% crit rate. That's before any main or substats from artifacts, which effectively means that it makes crit rate a dead stat in your artifacts, which makes it a lot harder to have high quality artifacts. We're going to talk about the implications of all of that when we talk about weapons and artifacts later on, but it is something that's worth mentioning when it comes to her Ascension stat. Crit rate is definitely not the best. She would have much rather getting either crit damage or damage percent, which are stats that she's not going to overcap. Hell, honestly, HP percent wouldn't be better, but it would be more comfortable to build around. Next, let's get into her kit. We don't really need to read her normal attacks because they're bad. The main purpose of her normal attacks is, as we're going to see when we talk about the rest of the abilities, she doesn't have a way to apply Hydro outside of actually doing her damage. So very similar to a character like Hu Tao, where you can't use her own Pyro as a way to set up your VV. But unlike Hu Tao, she's a Catalyst user, which means that she can actually use her Hydro because of her normal attacks. Her normal attacks dealing Hydro damage is going to be useful in order to set up VV or any other setup reactions you need with Hydro, but the normal attacks themselves are pretty bad. Next up, the bread and butter of her kit, Surf Shark Wave Breaker. Combining her mastery of speed and the waves of water, Mualani can surf anytime, anywhere. After using this skill, Mualani will gain 60 Night Soul points and enter the Night Soul's Blessing state. This is the first pre-release I'm doing on a Natlan character, so we're gonna have to do a little bit of clarification in terms of what Night Soul is. Night Soul is the Natlan exclusive mechanic, like Uzia and Numa was in Fontaine. And honestly, it kind of doesn't matter. Being in the Night Soul's Blessing state, what that means is you are currently doing something that has Night Soul, and in and of itself it doesn't do anything, but some external effects, like the new artifact set that's coming, are conditional on being in the Night Soul Blessing state. But the Night Soul Blessing state itself doesn't actually have an effect. Night Soul points, on the other hand, do something, but what they do is dependent on the character. So in Mualani's case, Night Soul's Blessing Mualani, so when she is in her Night Soul Blessing state, when she's surfing basically, continuously consume Night Soul points. When they're depleted, or you can cancel it early, Mualani's Night Soul Blessing will end. So, You can think of it a lot like Wanderer's like second stamina bar that appears when you use his E. It effectively works the exact same way. It's just a visual indicator of duration counter for her. It gets depleted over time, and as we're going to see a little bit later on, you have a way to refill it. For Mualani, when she's in the Night Soul's Blessing state, she mounts her Sharky surfboard, so she starts surfing. You can move on water, and I think this is just what they call the lava in Natlan. And she will take no damage from the lava. Normal attacks will be converted to Sharky's Bites, dealing Night Soul aligned hydro damage. So Night Soul aligned, again, doesn't really mean anything, but when you deal Night Soul aligned damage, it will trigger Night Soul Burst, which also doesn't do anything, but is another trigger condition for things. In Mualani's case, that's related to her Ascension 4 passive. Whenever a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul Burst, she will gain 1 stack of Wave Chaser's exploits, up to 3 stacks, which increases her burst damage based on how many stacks. Anyways, damage dealt this way is considered normal attack damage. When she makes contact with opponents in this state, Mualani applies Marked as Prey to them and gains 1 wave momentum stacks, up to 3 stacks. 1 stack can be gained from the same opponent every 0.7 seconds. So, while she's surfing, when she goes through enemies, she gains stacks, up to 3. When Mualani uses Sharky's Bite, when she does her normal attack while surfing, her damage dealt increases based on wave momentum stacks. When she has 3 stacks, you will use Sharky's Surging Bite instead of Sharky's Bite, dealing even more damage and removing all stacks. When you use a Sharky's Bite on an enemy that has the mark from colliding with them, it will effectively fire the damage from her Sharky's Bite to all of the enemies that are marked, which is going to help her a lot in AoE situations. It effectively means that if you're against a lot of enemies, you can go through all of them and then use your enhanced normal attack, and even if you hit only one of them, it's going to deal damage to all of them. However, when there's multiple enemies hit by it, the damage dealt is going to be decreased. It's a lot of words. To try to simplify it, use your E, start surfing, go through enemies. When you've gone through either 3 different enemies or the same enemy 3 times, or a mix of those 2, you fire a Pog normal attack that does a lot of damage. And I do mean a lot of damage. Let's take a look at the numbers. The base damage of Sharky's Bite is 14.76% of max HP. The amount of damage that you gain per stack is 7.38% of max HP. And the additional damage when you're on max stack is another 36.89% HP. Which means that it's about 74% of her max HP, which is almost as much as Nilo's full burst. And you can get multiple of them. Before we can completely cover the nerfs, we have to very quickly talk about her Ascension 1 passive. When Sharky's Surging Bite hits an opponent, a puffer will be generated nearby. Mualani will restore 20 Night Soul points when she picks up a puffer. Puffers, from what I've seen, seem pretty brain dead to pick up. You don't have to like focus too hard like you would when it comes to like picking up Xiangling's pepper or the leaf from the Sumeru craftables. Only 2 such puffers can be created this way during her skill, and effectively it just restores 20 Night Soul points, which means that the total Night Soul points that she's gonna get is 60 plus 20 twice, right? So plus 40 for a total of 100. And by the way, the Night Soul point consumption is about 10 per second, so the base 60 points is about 6 seconds. In terms of the damage that you get from 1 bite, it's about 60% in her latest beta iteration of what it was in her first beta iteration, right? Which is a 40% damage nerf, which is a massive difference. In exchange for that, you do get, well, we're gonna see later, slightly higher burst scaling, but more importantly, longer skill duration. In her first beta iteration, with the footage I've seen, it seems like in the average single target scenario, you could reliably get 2 bites, but 3 depended a lot on the enemy. Some enemies' hitbox is a little weird and wonky, and you get stacks, and you want to get 3 stacks before you use your normal attack, obviously. Right? It's about half of her damage, almost. But yeah, against enemies with weird hitboxes, because she gains stacks on hitbox collision, it can be a little weird. So against enemies like Primo Giovishap, for example, it's a little wonky. Bosses in general are going to tend to be harder than just base enemies. When she's in AoE, she gains stacks a lot faster because her cooldown is per enemy, not total. Anyways, point being, in her first version, you could reliably get 2. In a decent amount of situations, get 2 plus an additional 1 that wasn't fully stacked. And in very rare situations, actually get 3. Now, you can relatively reliably get 3. In a decent amount of situations, get 3 plus a non-fully stacked one, and in some rare situations get 4. That's not by itself anywhere near enough to make up for the damage nerfs. So she is definitely not nearly as broken as she was in her first version. But these are relatively strong mitigating factors. She is not 40% worse than she used to be. One of the issues with those mitigating factors, though, is that, yeah, you're getting more hits, but the hits are coming out as quickly. Like, getting 3 hits instead of 2 doesn't mean you're getting 50% more damage, because a lot of buffs don't last for the full duration. On top of that, in her first iteration, almost half of her damage was on the base Sharky's Bite, which meant that the last hit, if she wasn't able to get to fully stack it, still dealt a pretty good chunk of damage. Whereas now, that last hit does a lot less, because most of the damage is backloaded into the enhanced attack. Finally, we have her ult. Fires a Super Shark missile that can track opponents, dealing Night Soul aligned AoE hydro damage based on Mualani's max HP. It's about 100 motion value, and her Ascension 4 passive makes that increase to very reliably about 115 motion value because of the first one. The cooldown on proccing the Night Soul burst, that is the condition for the damage increase from Ascension 4, is going to depend on how many Natlan characters you have in your party, right? So that's another Night Soul mechanic. If you have one character, it's 18 seconds, or 15, I think it's 18. 2 characters, it's 12, and 3 characters, it's 9. We don't have a lot of Natlan character options, so you're most likely only going to have one Natlan character on your team, so it's going to be once per rotation that you proc this, so 15. But eventually could be 30 or even 45. One thing that's worth mentioning is that energy cost is 60, but as we're going to see, a lot of her teams struggle in terms of particle generation, so her energy cost not being that high doesn't actually mean that her ER requirements are low. In a lot of teams, her ER requirements to burst every rotation are actually high enough that you don't want to burst every rotation. The amount of ER that you'd have to build in order to get your burst reliably every rotation is so high that it is less damage than to just get your burst every other rotation without building ER. And if you do get your burst every other rotation, that means you're going to get probably 2 stacks of Night Soul burst instead of 1. It's going to hit a little bit harder. Now that we have a basic understanding of her kit, how do you work around a character that wants to surf around the battlefield for a little bit and then do a big nuke and then repeat that a few times? The best way to take advantage of a kit like this is obviously going to be in a Forward Vape team. Her whole kit is built around very slow attacks that deal a lot of damage. She doesn't have ICD on her Sharky's Bite, which means she can react on every hit. She applies it slowly enough that it's very easy to apply the pyro you need, and she doesn't really do anything other than that damage. So because of that, she is very clearly a character that is designed around Forward Vaping. Do you have to play her in Forward Vape? No. She's still playable in other teams. You can still use her in like a Mono Hydro team or something like that, but you're obviously not taking advantage of her kit nearly as much. As we're gonna see, her team options are kind of lacking right now. It's something I've talked about a decent amount in the past, but I haven't talked about too much recently. But when it comes to Forward Vape teams, the reason why we haven't had many that are popular isn't just the lack of Forward Vape Hydro units. It's also the fact that there aren't really non-Hydro units that you'd want to put in those teams that would be very good. And that's definitely something that we're gonna see with her, is the lack of currently available units that synergize well with her. This is something that is very likely going to be remedied by the Pyro Archon. But yeah, and again, we don't have any actual reliable leaks on the Pyro Archon yet, so it might not be the Pyro Archon themselves, it might be another character that comes in Natlan. But I very much do expect some support for Mualani teams later on, because as we're going to talk about when we talk about the teams, she has teams that are good, but a lot of them are going to be pretty clunky or going to have a very obvious flaw that would be fixed, that could easily be fixed if a character was trying to fix it. But because of that current somewhat lack of synergistic units, it makes it so that non-vape teams are still not that far behind the vape teams, and they're still completely viable. If you don't want to bother playing a vape team, you just want to slot her into your Mono Hydro team, you'll be completely fine doing so. It's not gonna suck. Okay, Constellations. C1, her first chomp in her skill is increased by 66% of her HP and exploration passive. This is a pretty big deal for the VV Vape teams that often only end up getting one chomp fully buffed. 66% more motion value is almost double the damage. It's a good constellation, but it's nothing Like, it's not game breaking, but it does help you front load it, which is going to make it feel quite good. C2 gains 2 stacks when she enters Night Soul, so she can get her first chomp earlier, and gain 1 stack whenever she obtains a puffer, so she gets more chomps overall. I haven't seen too much footage of this, so I'm not entirely sure how many chomps you can reliably get with this. You also get increased duration of the skill. I would expect it to go to 4 instead of 3 reliably, 4 in the best case scenario. I would expect this to become 4 reliably, 5 in the best case scenario. C3, increase the level of Surfshark Wavebreaker by 3, so that's her skill, right? This doesn't increase the C1 damage though, so it's not as good as it would be, or as it would seem. C4 regenerates 8 energy when obtaining a puffer, and her ult deals 75% increased damage. This makes her ult nuke more, pretty good. C5 is ult damage or ult levels, which is also pretty good. And then C6 makes it so that the C1 applies to every skill instead of only the first one, which is also going to be pretty good. Overall, she definitely has above average constellations, especially because in a decent amount of her teams, she is the large majority of the team's damage. Her personal DPS is almost all of the team DPS, which means that increases to her damage are more impactful than if she was doing a third of the team's DPS. Between C1 and R1, I think they both have their pros and cons and are both, like, I wouldn't feel too bad about either. I think it's very much going to depend on what banners they're on. If the banner's good for the characters, I'd probably prefer C1. If the weapon banner is good, I'd probably prefer R1. Definitely think C1 R1 is better than C2. Before we talk more about the vape teams, we're going to do the usual pre-release stuff where we cover the weapons, artifact, sets, artifact, stats, and teams. For the first time in a pretty long time, honestly, the weapon section is going to be short. There are not many things to say about Mualani weapons because, honestly, it's very, very straightforward. A lot more weapons in this game are tailored towards attack scaling characters than characters that scale off of a different stat, which makes it so that when a non-standard, like a defense or HP or EM, I guess, scaling character has a very, very synergistic free-to-play option, a lot of the other alternatives that you'd usually consider decent stat stakes, even the 5-star options, are kind of just not that good. In Mualani's case, there are very, very few weapons that are worth talking about because of the existence of the upcoming Fontaine craftable, the Ring of Yaksha. HP substat weapon, medium base attack. Using an elemental skill grants you an effect that gives you normal attack damage bonus based on your max HP. At R5, for every 1,000 max HP, you increase your normal attack damage by 1%. And on an HP scaling character where you're likely to build an HP Sense as well, that already has over 15k base HP, capping this is very, very easy. So it effectively gives you 32 damage percent. And the reality is that a stat stick like this is enough to make most 5-star stat stakes just worse. One of the reasons for that is because of her potential crit overcap, which makes a lot of the crit weapons a lot worse than they otherwise would be. But honestly, even if it wasn't for that, it's just a pretty good stat stick. And HP scaling characters, unlike attack scaling characters, don't tend to have the best options when it comes to external HP buffs, right? There's no HP Bennett. And because Mualani is a character that is focused around vape, there are a lot less of her teams that are going to want to run double Hydro and get that 25% HP from the Hydro Resonance. And all of these things together make it so that the 41% HP you get from this is actually pretty competitive with crit substats. This being HP substat instead of crit is often not much worse, if not just straight up outright better. So, what are the weapons that are worth talking about outside of the Ring of Yaksha? So, Surf's Up gives you 88.2% crit damage. So it's low base attack, high substat, which is what you want. It gives you 20% HP, and this is a lot of text that effectively means you get 48% normal attack damage. If you don't trigger vapes and you put her in a monohydro team or something like that, this 48% normal attack damage can be lower, right? Because it starts at 48%. When you use a normal attack, it goes down by 12%. When you trigger a vape, it goes back up by 12%. So if you're triggering vape on all your normal attacks, it stays at 48. Otherwise, it goes down. Surf's Up, best in slot. If you just only look at the stats that it gives you, it looks like it's incredibly strong because it gives you a lot of different stuff. I want you to keep in mind that we have a very strong free-to-play option. When it comes to the increase from Ring of Yakuza to Surf's Up, it's actually pretty similar to, if not arguably lower in some cases, to the increase from free-to-play to Signature on a lot of other characters. The main difference is that the weapons in between for other characters are often a lot stronger. When it comes to Mualani, the weapons between her free-to-play and her Signature are a lot closer to the free-to-play than to the Signature. Ring of Yakuza, best free-to-play. Witsith is on average worse than her free-to-play option. It's worse than the Ring. However, Witsith is always a weapon that's worth talking about because it has a lot of variance in performance. When you get the right buff, it's insanely good, and when you don't, it's not. The average DPS on Witsith is a decent amount worse, even at high refine, than the Ring. But R5 Witsith with the right buff is more damage than her Signature. So if you're trying to speedrun and you don't have her Signature, Witsith is probably the way. Sacrificial Jade is going to be her best 4-star option. Obviously, it's not free-to-play available. However, there's a few things to mention. First, you are going to overcap crit. You are starting at 101% crit rate, which makes crit rate a completely worthless stat in your subsets. You would rather get flat HP than crit rate. You'd rather get flat defense, because at least it does something if you're using Sacrificial Jade on her. That's not entirely true, because the trigger condition to get the crit rate on the new artifact set is consuming Night Soul points. So if you use your burst before you use your skill, then crit rate substats on Sacrificial Jade aren't completely useless. They can make it so that your burst is more likely to crit. But outside of that, it's completely worthless. That being said, Sacrificial Jade's passive is much, much stronger than the average weapon passive. It looks a lot more like a 5-star weapon passive than a 4-star weapon passive. And Mualani is the first character that can actually properly make use of all of the parts of it. At R5, you get 64% max HP and 80 EM, which is, when it comes to just what you get out of a passive, pretty much a Signature 5 stars worth of stats. In the very rare situation where your best available artifacts don't have crit rate whatsoever, and you have R5 Sacrificial Jade, it's actually pretty close to her Signature. However, that's incredibly rare. The reality is that the perfect artifact for a Sacrificial Jade Mualani would have crit damage, HP percent, flat HP, and EM. And flat HP for Sacrificial Jade is a lot less of a damage increase than crit rate on a weapon where you're not already capped on crit rate, which means that you're inherently going to take a hit to artifact quality at high investment on Sacrificial Jade. My assumptions have included 5 crit rate total rolls. Depending on the artifacts you have available to you, it could be less or more. With my assumptions, Sacrificial Jade at R5 is about 5% better than her free-to-play option. If you manage to get a good artifact set built around Sacrificial Jade, it can go upwards of like 15% better. If you don't, it could even potentially be worse than the Ring of Yakuza. Keep in mind though, that's at R5. All in all, it's a good 4-star option, but there are not actually that many situations where it's much better than the free-to-play craftable, and it's only at high refine that it's good. So for most of you guys, it's not really worth thinking about. Tome of Eternal Flow, decent stat stick. It's slightly better than the Ring of Yakuza, just because it's a bigger stat stick. But, well, she doesn't do any charge attack damage, nor does she have a good way to reliably proc the passive. So you're probably not getting the energy back, and you're not benefiting from, even if you do manage to like get hit or something, the damage, charge attack damage bonus doesn't do anything. 1,000 Floating Dreams is the only other option that I think is like actually worth considering putting on her over her craftable. It gives you EM, which is actually a useful stat on her for her damage, and it gives you 30% damage from having 3 characters that are not Hydro, or 20% and 32 EM if you play a double Hydro team, which is just a good stat stick. In situations where you don't get a lot of external EM buffs, it is a decent amount better than the free-to-play craftable. But if you're playing with like Instructor on your team and like Nahida's buff or something like that, it is going to be about as good, if not slightly worse, than the Ring of Yakuza. And finally, just want to quickly mention Fab and Proto Amber. I don't think you should play either of these over the Ring of Yakuza. The reason for Proto Amber not being too good is that in most teams, you either generate such little energy for her that Prototype Amber's ER refund isn't enough to bring you to reasonable ER requirements, and you would still only use your burst every other rotation, which would mean that it's completely wasted. Or have ER requirements so low that it doesn't do much to begin with. That being said, a lot of people already have a leveled up prototype Amber, so I still think it's worth mentioning as like a transition option while you're building the Ring of Yaksha, because no one has it yet. It's going to be a new weapon. Fine day one option is what I'm going to call it. There could be teams where the ER requirements line up for Prototype Amber to be good. If they do, then Prototype Amber is going to be a reasonable option that's about as good as the Ring of Yaksha. And obviously you get some healing out of it, which can be nice if you don't have healers on your team. And then finally, Fav. Fav is the one weapon that actually gives you so much energy that it reliably gets you burst every rotation, even on teams with shit ER generation. Because of that, it's not actually that bad of a stat stick. Being able to use your burst every rotation instead of every other rotation does actually give you a decent amount of damage, but the damage that you're doing on each of your hits is obviously going to be lower because a lot of your power budget is into ER. Fav does help the rest of your team have smoother rotations, which is nice. Overall, Fav is not a weapon I would recommend over the Ring of Yaksha, but much like Prototype Amber, if you don't have a Ring of Yaksha yet, I think it's a completely reasonable day one option. Ordering them from best to worst, we're going to have Surfs up first, then 1,000 Floating Dreams, then Tome of Eternal Flow, then Sacrificial Jade, then Ring of Yaksha, then Witsith, then Proto Amber, then Fav. If you don't have any of your weapons built up and you don't have a Fav or a Proto Amber built and you still want a good day one option, you can also consider a lot of the other 5-star stat sticks. Stuff like Baizhu's weapon is fine, Kagura's is okay, Lost Prayers. But the reason I didn't mention them is because they're pretty much always worse than the Ring of Yaksha. So in terms of like build objective, it shouldn't be what's on your mind. Next, artifact sets. Obsidian Codex. While the equipping character is in the Night Soul's Blessing and is on the field, their damage dealt is increased by 15%, and after the equipping character consumes 1 Night Soul point while on the field, crit rate increased by 40% for 6 seconds. So effectively, it's a conditional 15% damage and 40% crit rate. It is her best in slot. If you're playing her with Farina, you can also play Maréchaussée, but Obsidian Codex is still better than Maréchaussée even in Farina teams. And then, because there's not that many teams where you're going to want to play Mualani with Farina, and because you can't pre-farm Obsidian Codex, what sort of artifacts do you want to use on day one? The reality is, there's nothing great. You can potentially use the Burning set, Unfinished Reverie, if you're playing her in a Burning team. You can use Gilded, I guess. Or you could use Art of Death. Or you could use the 2-piece option, Hope day one. The reality, though, is that Obsidian Codex is just really good. We're definitely seeing proper artifact power creep. So going for these options is going to be a noticeable dip in her overall output. Okay, next, artifact stats. You're generally going to want to go HP, damage, crit. The crit you're going to want most of the time is going to be crit damage. If you go crit rate on a non-crit rate weapon, you're starting at 97% crit rate, something like that. You're going to have the same issues as you do on Sacrificial Jade. So you almost always are going to want to crit damage circlet, not a crit rate. In teams where you don't get a lot of EM external buffs and you're not using a weapon that gives you EM Sands is also viable. You can also run HP main stat over damage or crit, but it's generally not better. Ideally, long term, this is what you want to aim for sure. When it comes to substats, you're looking for crit, you're looking for HP, you're looking for EM. And finally, let's talk about her teams. Mualani has an issue, which is the way that her kit is designed gives her a relatively long uptime with damage that comes out at the end of your animations rather than at the start, which makes it so that buff duration can become a pretty big problem. The fact that your stack generation happens before your damage rather than after your damage means that you have a guaranteed forced wait period where you have to be on her and your buffs are ticking down, but you're not actually doing any damage. And that is going to suck when it comes to buffs that have shorter duration, like VV, and just the buffs that you generally get from the Anemo units. Her teams that have the highest personal damage are still going to be those VV teams, but her lack of synergy with short buffs. And as we're going to talk about, the lack of great options when it comes to setups that get you maximized buff duration during her uptime make it so that even though at a glance you'd think that the VV teams are the best, a lot of alternatives that are buffs that are weaker but longer duration are going to end up being competitive. I think the best example of it is Nahida. Nahida is actually going to be a pretty good support for Mualani because the 250 EM she can provide with her burst, as well as the ability to proc burning. Burning is a reaction that doesn't hurt Mualani. While burning doesn't actually protect the pyro aura from vapes, it doesn't consume the pyro aura, and it sometimes even extends it. Although that's not really gonna, the extension isn't really gonna matter, but effectively it's a reaction that isn't going to hurt you. Other than that, even though Mualani has relatively good resistance to interruption during her surf, it's not resistance immunity like you'd get on Raiden Burst, for example, so shields are still useful. And Zhongli giving a 20-second duration buff that doesn't need a specific setup also makes him a reasonable option even if you don't need the shield, just because, again, there's not that many great options when it comes to actually increasing damage. Outside of that, you don't really have too many characters that give buffs. You have Farina that can give buffs, but obviously Farina also with your reactions. You could do some weird Numa Uzia swap Farina stuff, but I think most of the time if you're playing Farina, you just are going to be playing her with a very fast source of pyro like Xiangling and taking the L when you miss a vape because the timing lines up poorly. I think instead of separating it in team archetypes, I'll look at team partners. I think that's the best way to go about it because, again, right, when it comes to good teams, it's pretty much all going to be vape teams with, like, you can still play her in, like, Taser or Monohydro, but it's not, like, that synergistic with her kit. So I think I'll just talk about the separate units that you can play with her in those vape teams instead of the archetypes as a whole. So, in order to vape her, you're going to need some form of off-field pyro, but the type of off-field pyro you use, you have a little bit of flexibility for that. You can either go for a character that actually applies off-field pyro, you can go for an Animo unit applying off-field pyro, and even like when it comes to those two different options, because her application is so slow, you actually have a lot of choices when it comes to your pyro applicators. Xiangling applies enough pyro that you can actually consider using a second hydro unit, but even with a second hydro unit, you're not guaranteed to vape all of your stuff if you're using something like Farina. Because yes, you're applying a lot of pyro, but if your timing lines up poorly, you might get a vape from Farina right before you get a vape on Mualani, which is going to make you lose the vape. And because Mualani's individual hits are so much damage each, losing a vape on one of them is a pretty big deal, and it's not something you want. Again, her lack of like great partners means that Farina being there and doing personal damage and giving a buff kind of makes up for a few lost vapes here and there, but it's definitely not something you're too happy about. Outside of double hydro teams, Xiangling is actually not that amazing of an option for Mualani. One, because Mualani's teams very often can work in non-20 second rotations. You can do slightly shorter rotations with her uptime and cooldown. And obviously that's not going to work if you have a 20-second cooldown that's forcing you to wait. And if you're not playing a second hydro unit, having faster pyro application doesn't do anything. You're just going to apply pyro and not do anything. On top of that, Xiangling's personal damage, where you're not swirling pyro or getting Bennett buffs or vaping or any of that, is not actually that good. It's not completely insignificant, but it's nothing worth writing home about. And so sacrificing that small amount of personal damage for a better defensive option very often isn't much of a DPS loss. And then on top of that, if that defensive option has some form of synergy with Instructor or another support set that works well, it can actually even be a DPS gain for the team. So Mualani is a character that doesn't work too well with Xiangling, but that still has some teams where Xiangling is good. Next is Nahida. Nahida works quite well with Mualani. She gives a pretty big buff, and if you are playing her with a unit like Dehya as the pyro, Nahida's gonna have very good ownership of burning, which is not that much damage, but it's not completely insignificant either, because you have to build your Nahida full EM in order to get all of the value out of her passive anyways. So also having high EM for those burning procs is quite good. You can play Emilie either instead of Nahida or with Nahida. Emilie is going to have higher personal damage, but obviously doesn't offer the 250 EM buff that Nahida does. Zhongli is just a fine whatever option that you can put in pretty much any team archetype. Kazuha, like I said, is going to be in the teams that have higher personal damage on Mualani, but that aren't necessarily the best teams. The VV setups are going to be rough. The main reason for that is, again, right, like your damage on Mualani is coming out with a delay, which means that unless you swap directly from Kazuha to her, you're going to kind of struggle to get good uptime on your VV. And one of the big issues that you're going to potentially notice is that right, if I just go onto her now, the enemy doesn't have pyro on him, so I'm just standing there looking at him and I'm not gonna get the vape, right? So a rotation like this doesn't work. You'd have to like actually wait. Adding a wait into your rotation never feels good. Yeah, you can do plunge cancel. Like, there are ways to work around it. I'm not saying it's impossible. But it is generally going to be a lot more annoying. But yeah, so with Dehya, this is probably your best default setup. So for Thoma, you'd probably do something like this. With Xiangling, I don't think there's a good setup that actually allows you to swap directly from Kazuha to Xiangling, or to Mualani. With Xinyan, there is a setup that allows you to do it, but you do still lose some VV uptime because you have to use Kazuha's burst. You can think about, instead of Zhongli, using Candace, for example. That can help you with your setups, potentially. But all in all, both Kazuha and Sucrose, they're going to be good, but I don't think they're going to feel too comfortable to use for a lot of situations. And I would say that you should only play them if you're willing to learn the setups properly. Xinyan's ability to self-apply Pyro when you swap characters while her shield is active, right? When you swap characters, it self-applies Pyro, which means that you can use it as a way to Pyro infuse Kazuha's skill. It also gives you a little bit of defensive utility, so you can use Xinyan in some of the VV teams. But her lack of Pyro application from off field without using her ult at C2 or in AoE with her skill can be a bit of a problem. Dehya is actually a surprisingly decent option. Gives you some defensive utility and enough Pyro application because, again, the amount of Pyro that you actually need for Mualani is relatively low. Technically, it is possible that it's not enough. It's gonna... You might have to be a little bit careful. Might have to delay it a little bit, like in AoE situations, for example. Otherwise, you're gonna lose your vapes because you're gonna hit before Dehya procs. But if you have off-field damage dealers, even if you hit before Dehya procs, you can still get the Pyro app from those hits after. So in something like a Dehya, Emilie, Nahida team, which I think is going to be one of the more, maybe not one of the more popular teams because it's using 3 5-star characters, one of which people think is ass, which is fair, right, within Dehya, and one of which is released without too much synergy with Emilie, right? Not too many teams where she's that great. Thoma's burst hits before Mualani's normal attack, from what I've seen, when you do the bite, which means that if the enemy doesn't have an aura, you will vape Mualani's bite. Mona's E is going to steal your reactions, but you can use Mona without using her E, or find a way to use her E during her setup. If you do, it's a potential option, but Mona's burst doesn't last too long, so you would probably want to do it in a team where you don't have off-field damage that would pop it early, because the buff duration starts when you pop the bubble. So if you apply the bubble and then go to Mualani and then start surfing, as far as I'm aware, the Mualani's surf doesn't deal poise damage, so you'll only pop the bubble when you do your first hit, which means it's going to last relatively long. However, if you use her E, that's not the case anymore, and her E can steal your reactions. Baizhu is a good healing option to consider in those Xiangling Farina teams. If you don't use a Dendro unit, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot, because once you lose your Hydro Aura, once you lose your Pyro Aura, if you apply Hydro, it's going to be really hard for Xiangling to get Pyro back on the enemy. Having a Dendro unit there to prevent you from applying Hydro by applying a Dendro Aura is going to help you with consistency of your application. You're still not gonna vape every hit unless you like time it properly, but it's going to help with your consistency a lot. And you know, Baizhu's a healer for arenas and fair. Candace is a unit that you should think about a lot like Zhongli in Mualani's teams. She just gives a bit of a damage bonus and that's it. There are going to be teams where Candace is actually a problem if you have her at C6, because you don't actually want to proc her C6 if it prevents you from getting Pyro back in teams that have relatively low Pyro application. Yelan, same thing. Yelan gives a damage bonus when you're in her ult, so she's a fine buffing option. From what I've seen, it seems like Yelan's coordinated attacks consistently hit after Mualani, but I'm not entirely sure of that. I've only seen so much footage, unfortunately, so big asterisk on that. But Yelan can be fine, again, just as an option that's there. But again, right, if you're playing a double Hydro team that limits your options for the last 2 slots, you need to have fast Pyro. Xiangling by herself might not even be enough depending on the situation. So it's most of the time something I would only really consider in teams that are like burn vape teams. Kachina is a character that is coming out with Mualani on her banner. Her kit doesn't really matter. You can think of her as budget Albedo, but what does matter is the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City artifact set, and the important part is the 4-piece, which effectively says if you trigger a reaction, gain 12% damage to both types of the reaction. If you trigger a reaction while in Night Soul Blessing, so if you're a Nutland character triggering a reaction, it's 40% instead of 12. Because of that, and because this is a buff that lasts for 20 seconds, she is a fine option just for the buff. Her damage is pretty awful, and her kit pretty much does nothing other than actual damage, which means that the only real reason why you would want to play her is to get this effect. But this effect is strong enough that she's still a fine option. And then Albedo or Chiori can just be put on the team because you have a free slot and you don't know what to put. Personally, the teams I'm looking forward to the most are Emilie, Nahida, Dehya, Kazuha, Xinyan, Zhongli. I'm obviously going to do a lot of testing with all the different VV setups with Pyro. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And that pretty much does it for the teams. I want to now quickly talk about what I'm expecting out of her in terms of meta. I think Mualani is a fine unit. I don't think she's anywhere on the same level as Neuvillette. I know a lot of people are wondering about that. I think her V1 was definitely arguably on the same level as Neuvillette, with a bit more damage but less, utility because she doesn't self-heal or have as easy of a time consolidating her damage in AoE. So her higher damage but also higher reliance on like team setups and worse quality of life, I think did in her V1 of beta make her on the same level as Neuvillette. I think with the nerfs that's not the case anymore. That being said, Neuvillette is the best carry in the game by a pretty significant margin, so not being on the same level as him doesn't make her bad. I think it's worth keeping in mind that even though, just like Neuvillette, she is an HP scaling Hydro Catalyst damage dealer, that doesn't actually mean they have that much overlap in teams. Just because 2 characters have the same scaling element and weapon type doesn't mean you play them in the same teams. And if you play them in different teams, then comparing them 1-to-1 doesn't really matter that much. If anything, I would argue that if you have every unit available to you, there's a lot more overlap between Arlecchino and Child than there is between Neuvillette and Mualani. Because Mualani has a lot of team options that rely on units that are not the same as the ones Neuvillette wants. And that's something I want you guys to keep in mind when it comes, because I've seen a lot of people saying, well, I already have Neuvillette, so what's the point of getting Mualani? And like, to some extent, I get that. It's a fair sentiment, but I just want to convey that the sentiment can also very much apply to other non-Hydro, non-Catalyst, non-HP scaling characters, and that in terms of what I expect out of their playstyle and teams, I do expect them to be somewhat different. Going back to her power, I'd say that when it comes to units that will be available on release, I think people are going to be slightly disappointed in her. Like, people that don't follow leaks are going to be slightly disappointed in her. I expect a similar reaction as Chlorinde, maybe. But it's hard to predict because, unlike Chlorinde, she doesn't have other units that do the same thing already. I expect her power level to be around that, right? Around like a pretty strong character with a decent amount of options when it comes to teammates, but nothing meta breaking. But all of that being said, I do expect her power to potentially get higher with future releases because, like I've said many times already in this pre-release, she has a lot of issues when it comes to synergy with other units. But yeah, so that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed your stay, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.